My son looked me straight in the eye in front of his wife, his friends, and half the room at the most expensive country club in Louisville and said, "Dad, you're just a burden."
He said it like he was finally throwing away something heavy he had been forced to carry. I did not answer him. I did not plead. I did not remind him who paid for his education, his house, his office, or the soft life he mistook for his own achievement. I only folded my napkin, stood up, and left. The next morning, I emptied the bank account he thought belonged to him. Then, I disappeared. My name is Thomas Whitaker. I am 72 years old, and until the week my son decided I was no longer worth respecting, I believed a man could survive almost anything if he had worked honestly, loved one woman faithfully, and raised his child with patience instead of pride. I was wrong about that last part. The day after Nathan called me a burden, I sat behind the wheel of my old blue 1984 Chevrolet pickup, watching gray fog hang low over the Ohio River. The heater coughed warm air against my knees. On the passenger seat sat a brown leather folder, a prepaid phone, and a cashier's receipt from Riverstone Private Bank, confirming a transfer large enough to ruin the man who thought he had already ruined me. Outside the truck, Louisville was waking up slowly. Delivery vans rattled over wet pavement. Office workers hurried past with coffee cups in their hands, none of them knowing an old man in a faded pickup had just moved $3.8 million out of reach with one signature and 4 words, "Trustee Authority, still active." That was the detail my son forgot. He forgot a lot of things. He forgot the nights I slept on warehouse floors because a shipment of hospital beds had to reach a rural nursing home before sunrise. He forgot the winter I drove through black ice with oxygen regulators strapped in the back because 3 patients in Frankfurt would not make it through the night without them. He forgot the way his mother Eleanor used to sit at our kitchen table, helping me stretch $1 into 3. Most of all, he forgot that the account he loved to brag about at parties was never truly his. It had his name on it, yes. That was the trap he walked into with a smile. It was a business operating reserve I created years earlier when I handed him partial control of Whitaker Medical Supply, the company Eleanor and I built from a borrowed van and a promise that no elderly person under our care would be treated like a problem to be hidden away. I placed Nathan as a secondary authorized signer because I wanted to believe responsibility could teach gratitude. A father can be very foolish when he is still trying to see the little boy inside the grown man. By 9 o'clock that morning, Nathan had called me 14 times. His name lit up the prepaid phone again and again, buzzing against the leather folder like an angry insect trapped under glass. I did not answer. A text followed. "Dad, what did you do?" Then another. "That money is mine. Call me now." Then one from his wife, Vanessa. "Thomas, this is completely inappropriate. You are scaring Nathan. We need to talk like adults." I looked at that message for a long time. Talk like adults. The phrase almost made me laugh, but the sound never came out. The night before, neither of them had spoken to me like an adult. They had spoken to me like furniture that had stayed too long in the wrong room, like a liability, like an old dog nobody wanted to feed anymore. I turned the phone face down and watched the river. If you are listening to this right now, tell me where you are from in the comments. Somewhere out there is another father, another mother, another grandparent sitting in silence while their own family mistakes kindness for weakness. The signs had been there for months. Vanessa stopped talking when I entered a room. Nathan began asking odd questions about my medical records, signatures, passwords, and future care preferences. He insisted I stop driving at night. Then, stop signing checks, then stop coming into the office unless he invited me. Each request came wrapped in concern. "We just want what's best for you, Dad." Those are dangerous words when they come from someone counting your money. The dinner that destroyed what remained of my illusion happened on a Friday evening in late October at the Ashbourne Club, a private place built of limestone, dark wood, and quiet judgment. It was supposed to be a memorial dinner for Eleanor on the 4th anniversary of her passing. I had reserved the back dining room because she loved the view of the old sycamore trees along the golf course. I had brought the silver locket she wore for 42 years, tucked inside my jacket pocket, because some foolish part of me still believed Nathan might want to hold it and remember who his mother had been. When I walked into that club under the glow of brass chandeliers, my son was already there. He was laughing with people I barely knew, wearing a navy suit I had paid for, holding a glass of bourbon older than his sense of gratitude. Vanessa stood beside him in a cream-colored dress, one hand resting on his arm, the other flashing the diamond bracelet Eleanor's life insurance had helped buy. Nathan saw me, and for half a second I searched his face for the boy who used to run across our warehouse floor and jump into my arms. All I found was impatience. I should have turned around right then, but fathers are stubborn creatures. Even when the house is burning, we keep looking for a way to save the child inside. To understand why I stayed at that table, you have to understand what Nathan once meant to me. He was not always the man who rolled his eyes when I entered a room. There was a time when those same hands he later called useless were the first thing he reached for when scared. Nathan was born on a rainy March morning in 1984. Eleanor held him against her chest and looked up at me with tears shining in her exhausted eyes. "Thomas," she whispered, "promise me he'll never feel unwanted." I promised her. I meant it with everything I had. Back then I was 32 years old and broke in the quiet, grinding way that leaves no room for pride. Our first delivery van was a dented white Dodge with a cracked windshield and a heater that only worked when it felt merciful. Whitaker Medical Supply was not a company yet. It was a phone number on cheap business cards and a stubborn idea that nursing homes deserved better equipment, faster service, and honest pricing. I had grown up watching old people get forgotten. My own father spent his final year in a county care facility where the beds squeaked and the hallways smelled of bleach and loneliness. One December evening I found him wrapped in a thin blanket, his hands trembling against the metal rail. "Tommy," he said, trying to smile, "don't let them make you old before you're ready." That sentence followed me for the rest of my life, so I built a business around it. Not because I was noble, but because I was angry. Angry at broken wheelchairs, angry at oxygen tanks delivered late, angry at families begging for basic dignity. I wanted a company that remembered the people everyone else forgot. Eleanor believed in that dream before anyone else did. She kept the books at our kitchen table, while Nathan slept in a laundry basket lined with clean towels beside her chair. On good weeks, we paid ourselves last. On bad weeks, we did not pay ourselves at all. There were nights I came home after midnight with my back screaming and my knuckles split open. Eleanor would be waiting in the kitchen in her old blue robe, a plate covered in foil beside a cup of reheated coffee. "Eat," she would say. "I'm too tired." Then chew slowly. That was Eleanor. Soft voice, iron spine. When Nathan was 6, he came with me on Saturday mornings. He sat in the passenger seat of the van with chocolate milk between his knees, wearing a cap that said Whitaker Medical Supply, even though it swallowed his little head. He helped carry clipboards and waved at every resident we passed. I used to watch that boy and think I had kept my promise to Eleanor. He was kind. He was gentle. He saw people. Somewhere along the way, that changed. Maybe it started when private school made him ashamed of the van. Maybe it deepened in college, when he discovered golf clubs finance majors and boys who talked about working people like they were a lower species. Maybe I helped create it by giving too much because I remembered having too little. A parent can confuse comfort with love. I paid his tuition at Vanderbilt without a loan. I bought him his first condo because he said renting was throwing money away. I gave him a position at the company after graduation, even though my warehouse manager, Luis, warned me quietly near the loading docks. "Mr. Whitaker," Luis said, "Nathan is smart, but he does not listen to people who know more than him." I smiled like a fool. "He's young," I said. "He'll learn." Luis looked at me with the sad patience of a man watching someone step toward a hole in the floor. "I hope so," he said. He did not learn. Nathan learned how to dress like leadership before he learned how to earn it. He learned words like efficiency, restructuring, and legacy planning. He learned how to sit at the head of a conference table and make men twice his age feel small. When Eleanor was alive, she could still reach him. "Nathan," she would say, "success without humility is just noise." He would kiss her cheek and behave for an hour. Then cancer took her. After Eleanor died, the house changed. First, rooms that once smelled of cinnamon and fresh laundry became cold and museums still. Her garden behind the kitchen went wild. For months, I slept in my recliner with a television glowing blue against the walls, not because I watched it, but because silence felt too much like being buried. Nathan was attentive at first. He called every few days. He came by with Vanessa and brought casseroles neither of them had cooked. He told me I should take time away from the company, that I had earned rest, that he could carry more responsibility. I wanted to believe him. Vanessa encouraged it with a tenderness that now makes my stomach tighten. "Thomas," she said one afternoon in my living room, "Nathan wants to honor what you built. Let him step up. Let him protect you." Protect me? That word again. Within a year, Nathan became president of Whitaker Medical Supply. I remained founder and chairman, retaining controlling trust authority over several reserve accounts, though I rarely mentioned that out loud. Nathan received a generous salary, bonuses, and signing authority on selected operating accounts. He moved into a 5-bedroom brick house I helped purchase in St. Matthews. He drove a black Range Rover leased through the business. I paid for their house repairs, their vacations, their emergencies. Every check was received with relief first, then expectation, then silence. Gratitude has a sound. So does entitlement. By the time I realized Nathan no longer heard the difference, he was already sitting across from me at the Ashbourne Club, looking annoyed that I had arrived at my wife's memorial dinner. That was the road that brought me to that table. Not one bad night, not one cruel sentence. 40 years of love labor and blind forgiveness carried me there. And when my son finally opened his mouth, he did not just insult me. He insulted every sacrifice that built his life. The first thing Nathan said to me that evening was not hello. It was, "Dad, you're early." I looked at the gold watch on my wrist the old Hamilton Eleanor had given me on our 25th anniversary. The hands showed exactly 6:58. The reservation was for 7. "I suppose age makes a man cautious about time," I said. Nathan gave a small laugh, but it had no warmth. Vanessa smiled the way a person smiles at a waiter who has brought the wrong wine. Around them sat 2 couples from their new circle at the club, Grant and Marcy Bell, who owned dealerships outside Lexington and Preston, and Claire Harlow, who looked at everything as if deciding whether it belonged in their home. There was an empty chair beside Nathan. Mine was at the far end of the long table. That small detail told me more than any speech could have. Eleanor's memorial dinner had somehow been arranged like a business entertainment evening, with my son seated at the center and me placed where a quiet old relative could be ignored. The table was set with white linen, heavy silver, and crystal glasses that caught the chandelier light. Beyond the windows, the golf course faded into blue dusk. I lowered myself into the chair and placed my hand over the locket in my jacket pocket. Nathan ordered bourbon before asking if I wanted anything. Vanessa told Marcy about renovations to their kitchen. Grant laughed about a boat. Preston mentioned private equity. Claire asked who did Vanessa's floral arrangements. Nobody said Eleanor's name. For 20 minutes, I sat at my wife's memorial dinner listening to strangers discuss marble boats, tax shelters, and tennis lessons. Finally, I leaned forward and said, I'd like to say something about Eleanor. The table quieted, though not completely. Nathan's eyes flicked toward me with irritation, as if I had interrupted a negotiation. Of course, Dad, he said. Go ahead. I took the locket from my pocket and held it in my palm. Inside was a tiny photograph of Eleanor at 38, laughing in the parking lot of our first warehouse. Your mother wore this almost every day, I said. She had very little interest in expensive things, but she loved this because you gave it to her when you were 10. You saved allowance money for 6 months. For a moment, something moved across my son's face. Not grief exactly, more like discomfort at being reminded he had once been tender. Vanessa reached for her wine. I continued. Eleanor believed a business should be measured by more than revenue. She used to say the real test was whether people slept better because we had shown up. That is why next month I intend to donate $100,000 from my personal savings to the Eleanor Whitaker Care Fund. It will provide emergency medical beds, oxygen equipment, and mobility chairs to rural nursing homes that cannot afford fast replacement. The silence that followed was not respectful. It was sharp. Nathan slowly set down his glass. His jaw tightened. 100,000, he said. Yes. From what account? My personal savings. His face changed, a darkening behind the eyes. Vanessa's hand moved under the table. I saw her fingers press against his knee, warning him, controlling him, or perhaps encouraging him. He did not choose carefully. Dad, Nathan said, his voice low. We talked about this. No, I said. You talked. I listened. Grant looked down at his plate. Marcy froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. The waiter with salads sensed the temperature of the table and vanished. Nathan leaned back and gave a short, bitter laugh. This is exactly what I mean, he said. You make emotional decisions, then everyone else deals with the consequences. The money is mine, Nathan. That was when his mask slipped. He placed both hands flat on the table and leaned toward me. Is it because, from where I'm sitting, everything you have is tied to a company I'm trying to keep alive while you wander around writing checks to make yourself feel useful? The word useful landed softly, but it cut deep. That fund would honor your mother, I said. Don't use Mom to justify this, he snapped. The room tightened. Rain struck harder against the windows. Somewhere behind me, a piano played an old standard Eleanor used to hum. I should have stopped speaking. I should have folded the locket back into my pocket and let the evening die quietly. Instead, I asked, when did honoring your mother become a waste to you? Nathan's face flushed red. Vanessa whispered, Nathan. But he had crossed whatever line men cross when pride starts doing the thinking. He pushed his chair back so sharply the legs scraped against the polished floor. Conversations at nearby tables faltered. Several heads turned. You want the truth? He said. Fine. I am exhausted from cleaning up after your sentimental decisions. You don't understand the market anymore. You don't understand modern business. You don't understand how much pressure I'm under while you sit in that big, empty house, pretending every check you write is some grand moral gesture. I felt my heartbeat slow. That happens when pain becomes too large for the body to process. Everything gets clear. The bourbon smell, the rain, the tiny vein pulsing in my son's neck. Nathan pointed one finger at me. "Dad, you're just a burden," he said. "Stop acting like this money is still yours." No one moved. Vanessa closed her eyes, but not in shame, in calculation. The words did not echo through the room the way shouting does. They sank into the tablecloth, into the silverware, into the empty chair where Eleanor should have been. I looked at the locket in my palm and imagined my wife hearing him. I did not answer, not because I had nothing to say, but because a father knows the difference between a wound and a revelation. A wound hurts. A revelation tells you what must be done next. I closed the locket gently. I placed it back inside my jacket. Then I reached for my water glass, took one slow sip, and looked at the man who carried my name, but none of my gratitude. That was the exact moment I stopped trying to save my son from himself. For several seconds after Nathan said those words, the dining room seemed to lose its air. The older couple near the fireplace stopped cutting their steaks. A man at the bar looked down into his drink the way decent strangers do when embarrassment becomes too intimate to watch. The pianist kept playing, but the notes sounded distant, as if they were coming from another building. Nathan was breathing hard through his nose. His finger still hovered in my direction, accusing me of existing too long. Vanessa recovered first. She reached for his wrist and whispered, "Sit down." Not because he had hurt me, because he had exposed himself. That was when I understood she was not embarrassed by cruelty. She was embarrassed by witnesses. People like Vanessa could tolerate almost anything as long as the furniture could not testify. I looked from her hand to Nathan's face. He was waiting for the performance he expected from an old man. Maybe he wanted me to tremble. Maybe he wanted me to raise my voice so he could later tell everyone I had become unstable. I gave him none of it. I slowly unfolded my napkin from my lap and placed it beside my untouched plate. My movements were deliberate, almost gentle. That frightened him more than anger would have. "Dad," he said, though his voice had lost some of its force. I did not answer. I reached for the leather check holder near the edge of the table. At places like Ashburn, staff could sense when an evening needed to be buried quickly. The total was obscene. Bourbon wine, appetizers no one cared about, steaks barely touched. My son had called me a burden during a dinner I was paying for. I placed my black card inside the folder and raised one hand. The waiter appeared at once. "Please run that," I said quietly, "and add 30% for yourself and the staff. No one here should suffer because of poor manners." His eyes flickered toward Nathan, then back to me. "Of course, sir." Nathan's face darkened. "Dad, don't do this." Now he wanted control, not reconciliation. Control. I looked at him for the first time since the sentence had left his mouth. "Do what? You know what I mean." "I do not think you know what you mean, Nathan." The table remained silent. Grant Bell stared at his hands. Claire Harlow pretended to read a message on her phone. Preston looked uncomfortable in the way men look when money and family collide. Vanessa leaned forward, voice soft as cream. "Thomas, maybe everyone is emotional tonight. Eleanor meant a great deal to all of us. Let's not make any dramatic decisions at the table." That was the first time she had said my wife's name all evening. I turned to her. "Do not use Eleanor as a towel to clean up what your husband spilled." Her mouth tightened. "Only a fraction. Enough." The waiter returned with the receipt. I signed slowly. My hand did not shake. Later, when they tried to paint me as confused or unstable, I wanted at least one waiter in Louisville to remember that Thomas Whitaker paid a bill calmly after being humiliated by his own son. I slipped the card back into my wallet and stood. Nathan stood too quickly. "Where are you going?" "Home," I said. "We are not finished talking." "Yes," I said, "we are." He gave a bitter laugh. This is exactly the problem. You shut down whenever anyone tells you the truth. The truth. A dangerous word in the mouth of a liar. I looked at the people seated around him. All of you have a pleasant evening. Then I turned and walked away. Behind me, Nathan said, not loud, but not softly enough, "There he goes, St. Thomas, wounded again." I kept walking. Every step from that dining room to the front entrance felt longer than it should have. The hallway smelled of polished wood cigar smoke and old money. At the coat desk, a young attendant handed me my charcoal overcoat. His eyes were red with embarrassment. He had heard enough. "Thank you, son," I said. The word son nearly broke me. Outside, the October rain had turned cold and hard. My driver, Paul, stepped out of the black Lincoln I usually used for formal evenings. "Home, Mr. Whitaker." I looked at the car, then toward the far end of the lot where the old blue Chevy sat under a security lamp. I had driven it earlier to the warehouse and left it there before Paul brought me to the club. "No, Paul," I said. "Take the night off." He frowned. "Sir, it's pouring." I've driven through worse. Paul had worked for me 12 years. He knew when not to argue. He handed me the truck keys from the valet board. Business teaches a man one sacred habit: always know where your exits are. I crossed the lot in the rain. By the time I reached the Chevy, my hair was wet and my hands were cold. The truck smelled of vinyl, motor oil, and sawdust from a delivery crate I had hauled 2 weeks before. It smelled honest. I sat behind the wheel and finally let my face change. Not tears. Not yet. Just the loosening of a mask I had worn too long. On the dashboard was a faded photograph tucked above the speedometer. Eleanor, in her garden, smiling at something outside the frame. I touched 2 fingers to it. "You heard him," I whispered. The rain hammered the roof. For months, I had suspected Nathan and Vanessa were circling my life with intent. The questions about accounts, the requests for medical access, the pressure to sell the house, the sudden interest in reserve funds. I had hoped I was wrong, because hope is the last weakness of a father. That night, hope ended. I started the engine. The old Chevy coughed once, then roared awake. I did not drive home immediately. Instead, I headed toward the river where the city lights trembled on black water. By the time I reached the overlook, I knew exactly what I would do at sunrise. I would not fight Nathan in public. I would not argue with Vanessa in private. I would remove the one thing they believed gave them power over me. Then I would disappear long enough to learn what they had been hiding in the dark. At 4:17 the next morning, I was already awake. Men who spend 40 years delivering medical equipment before sunrise do not need alarm clocks. The body remembers urgency long after the world tells you to slow down. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark, with one lamp burning beside Eleanor's empty chair, listening to the refrigerator hum and the rainwater drip from the gutters outside. The house felt enormous around me, too enormous. Every room carried some small ghost of her. The yellow mug she used to drink tea from still sat in the cabinet above the stove. Her gardening gloves remained on the mudroom shelf, stiff with dried soil. In the hallway, her framed needlepoint still read, "A home is where kindness stays." I looked at those words for a long time. Kindness had stayed. Gratitude had not. At 4:45, I climbed the stairs to my study and unlocked the bottom drawer of my old oak desk. Inside was a folder Nathan had never seen. He thought all important documents lived in digital vaults, cloud drives, encrypted dashboards, and expensive software systems sold by men younger than his suits. He never understood paper. Paper had memory. Paper had signatures. Paper had dates, witnesses, seals, and language, carefully written by attorneys who charged by the hour and slept well afterward. I removed the original trust documents for the Whitaker Strategic Reserve Account, a business operating fund established 12 years earlier after Eleanor's first cancer scare. The purpose had been simple: protect payroll emergency inventory, rural care contracts, and employee benefits, if the company ever faced a sudden leadership crisis. I was the founding trustee. Nathan was listed as secondary authorized signer. Secondary. That one word was going to ruin his morning. I had added him years ago when I still believed trust could be taught by giving a man responsibility before giving him control. He was allowed to initiate routine vendor transfers under strict thresholds. He was allowed to view balances. He was allowed to believe he mattered. He was not allowed to own it. But Nathan had spent the last year treating that reserve like a throne. He referenced it at board dinners. He bragged to lenders about liquidity. He told Vanessa, loudly enough for me to hear one afternoon, that the old man finally put real money where I can use it. Where I can use it. I should have acted then. I did not. At 5:30, I showered, shaved, and dressed in my dark gray suit. Not because I wanted to look powerful, because banks, like courtrooms and funeral homes, are places where a man should show respect for what is being buried. By 6:20, I was in the old Chevy, heading downtown through streets glazed with rain. Louisville looked bruised under the morning clouds. Traffic lights blinked red over empty intersections. Steam rose from sewer grates. The city had not yet put on its polite face. Riverstone Private Bank occupied the first 3 floors of a limestone building near Main Street. I had banked there since before Nathan knew how to spell collateral. The doors did not open to the public until 8, but men with certain accounts and older relationships still knew which side entrance had a security guard named Russell, who remembered Christmas bonuses. "Morning, Mr. Whitaker," Russell said, opening the door. "Morning, Russell." He looked at my face and did not ask how I was. That is why I always liked him. My private banking officer, Margaret Ellis, met me upstairs in a conference room with frosted glass walls and a pot of coffee already waiting. Margaret was 61, sharp-eyed and allergic to nonsense. She had handled Eleanor's estate settlement with a grace I had not forgotten. She closed the door behind her. "Thomas," she said carefully, "I received your message. Are you certain you want to execute the full transfer this morning?" I placed the trust documents on the table. "I am." She sat across from me and opened the folder. "Nathan will be notified the moment online access reflects the change." "I know. He may claim financial interference. He may claim he is the governor of Kentucky if it comforts him. The documents say what they say." A small smile touched her mouth, then vanished. "Where are the funds going?" "For now, into the protected holding structure we discussed. Payroll shield, rural equipment commitments, employee health reserve, and the Eleanor Care Fund." Margaret looked up at me. "All of it. All of it." She studied me for a long moment. "Did something happen last night?" "There are questions that deserve truth but not detail. My son said something honest," I replied. I decided to believe him. Margaret's expression hardened with understanding. She had worked with enough wealthy families to know cruelty rarely arrived without paperwork following close behind. For the next 40 minutes, we reviewed authorizations, trustee powers, transfer limits, reserve language, and receiving accounts. Margaret called in a second officer as witness. I signed 6 documents with slow, steady strokes. Every signature looked exactly like the man I still was. At 7:36 a.m., Margaret pressed the final key. A printer whispered against the wall. She handed me the confirmation receipt. Transfer completed. $3,842,611.19. Removed from the account Nathan thought he controlled. Protected by instruments he had never bothered to read. For a moment I expected to feel triumph. I did not. I felt grief with clean edges. No father wants to build a trap for his own son. But there comes a morning when a man must choose between enabling betrayal and preserving what decent people depend on. I folded the receipt and placed it inside my jacket. At 8:14, my regular phone began ringing. Nathan. I watched his name flash across the screen until it stopped. Then it rang again, and again. By the time I reached the parking garage, there were 7 missed calls and 3 texts. Dad, call me immediately. What happened to the reserve account? This is not funny. At 8:27, Vanessa called. I let it go. At 8:31, Nathan left a voicemail. I played it through the truck's speaker while sitting behind the wheel. His voice was tight, breathless, stripped of every polished word he used in front of investors. Dad, I don't know what kind of stunt you think you're pulling, but that account is operating capital. You had no right to touch it. We have obligations. We have pending wires. You need to reverse this right now before you create a serious problem. A serious problem. Not, are you all right? Not, I'm sorry. Not, I should never have said what I said. Only the money. I deleted the voicemail. Then another message arrived. You're proving exactly why we're worried about you. There it was. The first thread of the net. I started the truck, pulled out of the garage, and drove toward the old warehouse district instead of home. In the rearview mirror, Riverstone Private Bank disappeared behind wet glass and morning traffic. Nathan thought I had acted out of wounded pride. He thought he still had time to corner me, shame me, maybe frighten me back into obedience. He did not understand that the account was never the weapon. It was the alarm bell. And now that it had rung, I was going to find out who came running. I drove toward the old warehouse district because it was the last place Nathan would think to look for me. To him, that part of Louisville was an embarrassment, a stretch of cracked pavement loading bays, chain-link fences, and rust-colored buildings that smelled of diesel rain and old labor. To me, it was holy ground. Our first real warehouse stood on Baxter Avenue, behind a tire shop and a pawn store, a low brick structure with a faded Whitaker Medical Supply sign still bolted above the bay door. I had kept the property after we moved headquarters east, even when Nathan called it dead weight. Dead weight had a habit of saving me. I parked the Chevy behind the building where weeds pushed through broken asphalt. The rain had softened to a mist. My phone buzzed again. Nathan, then Vanessa, then Nathan. I powered it off. The silence that followed felt physical, like stepping out of a room full of smoke. I removed the battery, placed the phone inside an old coffee can near the loading dock, and shut the lid. If Nathan had installed tracking software on it, let him follow my ghost around an empty warehouse. Inside the building smelled exactly the way I remembered cardboard machine oil dust and cold concrete. The lights flickered when I flipped the breaker. Rows of unused shelving stood in the dimness like witnesses. Near the back wall was a small office with a metal desk, a cracked vinyl chair, and a faded photograph of Eleanor holding a clipboard. I touched the frame with 2 fingers. "I'm sorry," I whispered. I let him get too close to the keys. In the bottom drawer was an old canvas duffel bag I had packed months earlier when Nathan's concern began sounding too rehearsed. Clothes, cash, a prepaid phone, copies of trust papers, a spare set of truck plates, my passport. I was not paranoid. I was a man who had started believing the evidence. By 10 o'clock, I had changed into jeans, work boots, and a faded University of Kentucky sweatshirt. Thomas Whitaker, grieving founder and inconvenient father, had walked into that warehouse. A tired old maintenance man walked out. The prepaid phone lit up once it connected to service. Only 3 people had that number. Margaret at the bank, Luis Alvarez, my warehouse manager of 31 years, and Ruth Callahan, the retired accountant, who knew every honest and dishonest dollar that had ever passed through my company. There was already one message from Margaret. Nathan came to the bank. He was angry asked for reversal authority. We declined. He mentioned competency concerns. Be careful. I read that last sentence twice. Competency concerns. The net was not coming. It was already in the air. At 10:42, a black Range Rover turned slowly past the front of the warehouse. It was Nathan's. He did not stop. He just rolled by once, then again 5 minutes later, slower the second time. I stood in the darkness behind the side window, watching my son search for the father he had decided was too old to matter. A voicemail appeared on the prepaid phone. Unknown number, but I knew his voice before the first word finished. Dad, wherever you are, you need to stop this immediately. You are putting the company in jeopardy. We had a vendor settlement scheduled for noon. Do you understand that noon? If that wire does not clear, we lose priority on the Tennessee expansion package. He paused, breathing hard. And before you start acting wounded about last night, maybe consider that you forced my hand. Vanessa and I have been trying to handle your decline privately. Do not make us involve the court. There it was, spoken plainly enough to chill the blood. Court. The Tennessee expansion package was a lie. We had no approved expansion in Tennessee, but a noon wire mattered to him. That meant the reserve account had been scheduled for something urgent, something he could not explain to the ordinary operating bank. At 12:07, everything happened. Margaret sent 3 alerts in rapid succession. Nathan had attempted an emergency executive override. Denied. Vanessa had called, claiming I was confused and possibly missing. Denied. A bank attorney had requested fresh documentation from Nathan's office. No response yet. Then Luis called. I answered because Luis never wasted words. Mr. Whitaker, he said, you safe? For the moment. A long silence. Forklifts beeped faintly behind him. Nathan just fired Denise in accounts payable. My stomach tightened. Why she refused to process a rush vendor change without backup. New recipient. Some consulting outfit. Bluegrass Strategic Partners. She said the routing numbers looked offshore. I closed my eyes. How much? 2.4 million. Luis lowered his voice. He is tearing through the office like a man with wolves at the door. Vanessa is here too. She is telling everyone you are having an episode. Did she use those words? Yes, sir. An episode. I looked toward the old photograph of Eleanor. Her smile seemed smaller in the gray light. Luis, I said, do not confront him. Do not warn Denise to talk. Quietly tell anyone loyal to copy what they can and go home sick if they feel unsafe. You want me to call the police? Not yet. He exhaled sharply. Mr. Whitaker, forgive me, but not yet sounds like a man standing on train tracks. No, I said. It sounds like a man waiting to see who coupled the cars. After I hung up, I understood the shape of Nathan's panic. The account I emptied was not merely money he liked controlling. It was the patch over a hole. He had built some false transaction, some hidden obligation, some debt breathing down his neck, and I had just pulled away the tarp. By late afternoon, I left the warehouse through the rear alley, carrying the duffel bag. I switched the plates on the Chevy under an overpass while trucks roared above me, then drove west out of Louisville, keeping to county roads slick with rain and fallen leaves. I did not know yet how deep the betrayal ran, but I knew where to start. 40 miles outside the city, on a quiet road lined with black fences and winter fields, lived Ruth Callahan, the only accountant Nathan had ever feared. As the sun sank behind the hills, I turned into her gravel driveway and saw one lamp burning in her kitchen window. Ruth had been expecting me. Ruth Callahan opened the door before I knocked. She was 76 years old, 5 feet tall, in thick wool socks with eyes sharp enough to make a guilty man confess before coffee. Her white hair was pinned behind her head, Reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck. In one hand, she held peppermint tea. In the other, a small revolver pointed calmly at the floor. "You're late," she said. "I did not know we had an appointment." When a man like you empties a reserve account before breakfast and vanishes, he either comes to me or he goes to jail. I put water on. That was Ruth. No wasted sugar, no wasted fear. Her farmhouse sat on 10 quiet acres outside Shelbyville. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke, old paper, and rain. On the table were 3 banker boxes, a laptop, and a yellow legal pad covered in her handwriting. "You started without me," I said. "I started when Nathan pushed me out last spring." I stopped removing my coat. Ruth looked over her glasses. "He told the board I retired. He told me the same. I told him I would retire when my heart stopped. He said the company needed a modern financial culture. Then he offered me a severance package and a non-disclosure agreement thick enough to stop a bullet. Did you sign?" She gave me a look that could have curdled milk. "Thomas, I have known you since your hair was black and your shoes had holes. Do not insult me in my own kitchen." She opened the first box. Inside were invoices, printed, emails, wire confirmations, warehouse logs, property records, and photographs with sticky notes attached. Ruth did not explain them like a lawyer. She laid them down like a prosecutor setting knives on a table. The first knife was a consulting company I had never heard of, Cumberland Advisory Group. Every Friday, Whitaker Medical Supply had paid it $38,000. For what I asked, Ruth tapped the page. Nothing. The second knife was worse. Medical beds, oxygen concentrators, patient lifts, and mobility chairs had been ordered through our approved vendors, paid for by our company, then quietly redirected to a storage facility near the airport. I stared at the shipment photos. That equipment was meant for clients. "Yes," Ruth said. "Small nursing homes, rural facilities, places that trusted us." My chest tightened. Stealing money was one thing. Stealing equipment from old people who needed it to sleep, breathe, and stand safely was something else entirely. "That is not business fraud," I said quietly. "That is cruelty with invoices." Before Ruth could answer, headlights swept across the kitchen window. I stood too quickly. Ruth lifted one finger. "Easy. That is Elias." A gray pickup rolled to a stop outside. Elias Boone stepped out into the rain carrying a leather briefcase. He had been our outside counsel for 22 years before Nathan replaced him with a glass tower law firm full of young men who build by the breath. Elias came inside, shook rain from his coat, and placed a folder on Ruth's table. He did not ask if I was all right. Good lawyers know when a man is beyond that question. "I checked the county records," he said. I looked at the folder. Some part of me already knew. Elias opened it and turned the document toward me. My house. The house where Eleanor planted hydrangeas along the south fence. The house where Nathan took his first steps across the den rug. The house I paid off early because Eleanor hated death the way some people hate snakes. The owner line no longer listed Thomas Whitaker. It listed Nathaniel Whitaker and Vanessa Whitaker. My throat closed. "I never signed this," I said. "I know," Elias replied. "The notary is Vanessa's cousin. Her commission expired months ago." The room tilted slightly. I placed one hand on the table to steady myself. "They stole my home." Elias lowered his voice. "They tried to make it look like you gave it to them willingly." I looked down at my forged signature. It was good, almost perfect. Someone had practiced. Someone had sat somewhere with my name on a blank sheet of paper, copying the shape of my life until the lie looked real. Then Ruth pushed another folder toward me. Medical forms, draft statements, notes written in careful, cold language. Cognitive instability, impulsive decisions, possible dementia, requires family oversight. For a moment, all I heard was rain hitting the kitchen glass. "They are trying to say I am losing my mind," I said. Elias nodded once. "If they convince the right judge, they can take control of your money, your house, your company, shares, even your daily decisions." Ruth's voice softened. "Thomas, this was never just about money. No, it was about erasing me." Every strange question returned at once. Passwords, doctors, driving at night, Vanessa offering to schedule a wellness assessment, Nathan asking if I ever forgot where I parked. Concern had been the costume. Control had been the body underneath. Ruth turned her laptop toward me and clicked a video file. Grainy security footage filled the screen. Nathan stood inside an airport storage unit beside Vanessa and a man I did not recognize. They were loading sealed medical equipment into an unmarked truck. Ruth froze the image and pointed to the stranger. "Calvin Price," she said. "Private lender. Dangerous reputation." Elias looked grim. If Calvin Price is involved, Nathan is not stealing because he wants a nicer life. He is stealing because someone is collecting from him. I stared at the frozen image of my son. He looked nervous, pale, smaller than the man who had pointed at me across that country club table. For one painful second, I almost pitied him. Then I remembered Eleanor's locket in my palm. I remembered the word burden. Print everything I said. Ruth looked at me. "What are you going to do?" I picked up the forged deed, folded it carefully, and placed it inside my coat. "I am going to let Nathan believe his plan is working," I said. "Then I am going to find the part of it he is most afraid for me to see." Ruth's printer ran until nearly midnight. Page after page slid into the tray, warm and smelling of toner. Forged deeds, fake invoices, storage photos, suspicious transfers, medical notes, emails Nathan had probably believed were gone forever. Old accountants do not delete things. They save them with judgment. Elias spread everything across the kitchen table in order. Ruth made coffee so strong it tasted like punishment. Outside, the rain kept tapping against the farmhouse windows, steady and cold. At 1 in the morning, Elias stopped on a single email. "This," he said, "is what he was afraid you would find." The subject line read, "Final bridge payment and collateral release." The message was from Nathan to Calvin Price. I did not need a legal lecture to understand what it meant. Nathan owed Calvin $2.4 million by noon. The money was supposed to come from the Whitaker Strategic Reserve account, the account I had emptied that morning. Ruth tapped the paper. "That reserve was not just money to him," she said. "It was his escape hatch." Elias nodded. "And you closed it before he could crawl through." I looked at the frozen security footage on Ruth's laptop. Nathan beside the unmarked truck. Vanessa watching the door. Calvin Price standing with his hands in his coat pockets like a man who did not make threats because people already understood them. "So now Calvin comes after him," I said. "Most likely," Elias replied. "Good." Ruth studied me over the rim of her mug. "Thomas, I need to ask you something plainly. Did you move that money only because of what Nathan said at dinner? Or did you already know something was wrong?" The kitchen went still. There was no point lying to Ruth. She could hear falsehood in breathing. "I suspected," I said. I opened my leather folder and removed a smaller envelope sealed with one of Eleanor's old return address labels. I had carried it for 8 months. Inside were notes, bank alerts, copies of strange requests, and 3 statements showing Nathan had tried to push the reserve account beyond his authority. Ruth took the pages slowly. "You knew he was testing it. I knew someone was. Why didn't you stop him then?" That question hurt more than accusation. I looked toward the dark kitchen window. My reflection stared back at me, old and tired. "Because he is my son." Neither of them spoke. "That is not an excuse," I said. "It is the truth." I kept waiting for him to turn back before he crossed the line completely. I told myself he was arrogant, reckless, influenced by Vanessa, under pressure. My voice thinned. I did not want to believe my own child could become a stranger. Ruth's face softened. I pointed to the bank receipt on the table. That money was never Nathan's. It was not even mine in the way he imagined. Eleanor and I created that reserve after a nursing home in Pike County almost lost power during an ice storm. We drove generators and oxygen equipment there ourselves. On the way home, Eleanor said, "Tom, if something happens to us, promise me the people who depend on this company will not be left begging." I swallowed. So I made the reserve for them. Employees, patients, rural facilities, families who call at 2 in the morning because their mother's bed rail broke and nobody else will answer. The room became very quiet. "That account had Nathan's name on it because I wanted to teach him responsibility," I said. "But it was never his money." Ruth gave a short, sad laugh. "You did not empty his bank account." "No," I said. "I emptied the lie." The words settled over the table. Nathan believed I had robbed him because entitlement had taught him to mistake access for ownership. But the moment Margaret completed that transfer, the money returned to its true purpose. Payroll, medical equipment, employee health coverage, Eleanor's care fund. Not bourbon, not private lenders, not Vanessa's renovations, not my son's fear. A company is not a logo on a building. It is people who trust the lights will still be on Friday. Nathan had forgotten that. Elias removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "The money is protected now," he said, "but you are not. If Nathan files those medical papers tomorrow, he may still try to control you personally." "I know. If the forged deed is not challenged, he may claim you abandoned the house." "I know that, too." Ruth looked from Elias to me. "Then what is the next move?" I opened the oldest document in the leather folder. It was the original Whitaker Medical Supply shareholder agreement signed 26 years earlier. Elias had drafted it. Ruth had witnessed it. Eleanor had insisted on it after one of our early partners tried to borrow against company trucks without telling us. I turned to Section 9. Elias leaned forward. His face changed before he finished reading. "Thomas," he whispered. Ruth took the document and scanned the paragraph. The clause had a plain name because Eleanor hated fancy legal language. The breach of stewardship provision. It said one simple thing. If someone in power used protected company assets for personal gain, their authority could be frozen before they burned the whole company down. No courtroom speech, no 6-month fight. A fire door. Nathan had signed it when he became president. He had never read it. I closed the folder gently. "Tomorrow," I said, "my son will discover that I disappeared for a reason." By dawn, Ruth's farmhouse had become the quietest battlefield in Kentucky. Elias worked at the kitchen table with his sleeves rolled up, writing notices in the clean, hard language of a man who knew exactly where to place a blade. Ruth sat beside him, building a timeline from the records she had saved. I stood by the sink, watching pale morning light spread across the wet fields. The clause Eleanor insisted on was not dramatic. It did not shout. It waited. Years earlier, after a business partner tried to borrow against our trucks behind our backs, Eleanor had sat across from Elias and said, "Never again. If someone uses this company like a personal wallet, Thomas needs a way to stop the bleeding before lawyers spend half a year arguing over the knife." So we built that protection into the bones of Whitaker Medical Supply. Now Nathan had cut deep enough to trigger it. At 6:45, Elias slid the first notice toward me. "Once this goes out, Nathan will know you are not confused, missing, or helpless." "Good," I said. "He will panic. Better, he may move faster against you. I expect him to. Ruth looked up from her laptop. And Vanessa? She will cry in the right direction, I said. That is what people like her do when truth enters the room. Elias placed a second document on the table. We need 2 approvals from the independent review panel. The panel had been dormant for years. Nathan probably thought it was decorative, like an old award plaque in the lobby. It was not. One member was Dr. Henry Pike, a retired hospital administrator and one of our first clients. Another was Marlene Ortiz, a former compliance director who believed rules were written for people who thought they were too clever for decency. The third seat had belonged to Eleanor. After her death, it passed to Luis Alvarez. Nathan had ignored the exact people who could remove him. At 7:30, I called Luis. He answered before the first ring finished. Mr. Whitaker, can you get away from the building? I am already in the parking lot. Nathan sent security to collect Denise's laptop. I told her to take a sick day and leave through the back. Good man. What do you need? I need you to read something carefully. Then decide whether you can do your duty without thinking about my family. Luis was quiet for a moment. Sir, with respect, your family is not the only family at stake. That sentence steadied me. By 8:15, Elias had sent the evidence to Dr. Pike, Marlene, and Luis. Ruth attached only what mattered most: the forged deed, the fake payments, the stolen equipment footage, the attempted $2.4 million transfer, and the medical papers Nathan was preparing to use against me. No pile of legal fog, just enough truth to make honest people act. At 9:03, Dr. Pike called. His voice was older now, rougher, but still carried the command of a man who had run hospitals through snowstorms and budget cuts. Tom, he said, is this real? I wish it were not. That boy is trying to put you under guardianship. Yes. A long silence followed. Eleanor would have burned the whole city down. She built a better system than fire. You have my vote. At 9:22, Marlene sent written approval. One sentence. Activate immediately. Protect patients and employees. At 9:39, Luis signed from a copy shop 2 miles from headquarters. The fire door slammed shut. Within minutes, the company's high-risk transfers froze. Pending vendor changes stopped. Nathan's emergency access failed. The banks were notified. The payroll reserve was protected. The forged deed was flagged for review. At 10:14, my prepaid phone rang. Nathan. This time, I answered. For 2 seconds, all I heard was breathing. What did you do? He said. His voice was different, smaller. The polished executive was gone. Only the frightened man remained. I preserved the company, I said. You sabotaged me. No, Nathan. I removed your hands from the places they did not belong. You have no idea what you just triggered. I know exactly what I triggered. Vanessa's voice cut in from somewhere near him. Thomas, listen to me carefully. This behavior is going to be documented. You are confused, angry, and vulnerable. We are trying to protect you from yourself. I closed my eyes. Eleanor's locket felt heavy in my pocket. Vanessa, I said, you should spend less time practicing concern and more time finding a lawyer who understands expired notary commissions. The line went silent. Then Nathan came back low and vicious. You think this saves you? I have doctors. I have statements. By tonight, every person who matters will know you are unstable. Then bring them all, I said. What? Bring your doctors. Bring your lawyers. Bring whoever told you an old man would be easy to bury. My voice did not rise, but it hardened into something even I barely recognized. I am done hiding from the truth to spare you shame. I ended the call. Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight broke weakly over the fields, touching the fence posts in thin silver lines. At 11:30, Luis called again. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, "Nathan just ordered everyone into the main conference room at 3. He says he is addressing an emergency caused by your actions." I looked at Elias. He was already closing his briefcase. Ruth stood and gathered the folders. For the first time since the country club, I felt no urge to explain myself to my son. No urge to beg him to remember who I was. No urge to protect him from the shame he had earned. If Nathan wanted witnesses, I would give him witnesses. If he wanted a room full of people, I would give him the truth. "Then we should not keep him waiting," I said. Because the old man he tried to erase was finally walking back through the front door. At 2:47 that afternoon, I parked the old Chevy 2 blocks from Whitaker Medical Supply and sat with both hands on the wheel. The headquarters looked different when you knew it had been turned against you. The glass front reflected a pale Kentucky sky. The flag snapped above the entrance. Delivery trucks moved through the loading bays as if nothing inside the building had rotted. Elias sat beside me, briefcase across his knees. Ruth was in the back seat with 3 folders in her lap and the expression of a school teacher preparing to fail an entire class. "You do not have to walk in first," Elias said. "Yes," I replied, "I do." At exactly 3, we entered through the main doors. The receptionist, Kelly, who had sent flowers after Eleanor died, looked up and went pale. "Mr. Whitaker," she whispered. "Hello, Kelly. They said you were missing." "I was not missing," I said. "I was deciding who deserved to know where I was." The main conference room was packed. Managers, supervisors, finance staff, and 2 security guards stood along the wall. Nathan sat at the head of the long table in a charcoal suit, Vanessa beside him in white, as if she had dressed for innocence. Near the window stood Dr. Martin Vale, the physician whose name appeared on the draft cognitive evaluation. Beside him were 2 attorneys from Nathan's Glass Tower firm. On the screen behind them was my photograph. Under it were the words, "Emergency Leadership Continuity Response." Nathan had always loved making betrayal look professional. When I walked in the room, inhaled as one body, Nathan stood quickly. "Dad." I looked at the screen, then at him. "You found an unflattering picture." No one laughed, but several people almost did. Vanessa recovered first. "Thomas, thank God, everyone has been terribly worried. You frightened us." "I doubt that." Dr. Vale stepped forward with practiced gentleness. "Mr. Whitaker, my name is Dr. Vale. We are here to make sure you are safe. You are here because my son paid you to turn grief into a diagnosis." The room went utterly still. Nathan slammed one palm on the table. "Enough! This is exactly the volatility we have been dealing with." Elias stepped beside me. "Be careful, Nathan. You do not represent this company anymore." Nathan snapped. "No," Elias said calmly. "Today I represent the founding trustee." One of Nathan's attorneys stood. "Mr. Whitaker, due to concerns regarding your capacity, we have petitioned for emergency protective review. Until the court evaluates." Ruth dropped a folder onto the table. The sound cracked through the room. "Before you finish," she said, "you may want to read what your client tried to wire at noon yesterday." Nathan's eyes flicked toward her with pure hatred. "Ruth, you are not welcome here." "I was not welcome at the IRS audit in 1998 either," she said. "Yet facts survived my presence." Elias handed copies to the nearest managers. Papers moved down the table. Cumberland Advisory, Bluegrass Strategic Partners, storage unit footage, the defective deed, the expired notary, the attempted transfer to Calvin Price. Luis entered through the side door, followed by Dr. Pike and Marlene Ortiz. Behind them came 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies and a woman in a navy blazer carrying a state investigator's badge. Vanessa saw the badge and stood. "Nathan," she whispered. He looked toward the deputies, confused. For one wild second I believe he thought they had come for me. The investigator stepped forward. Nathaniel Whitaker. Nathan's mouth opened, but no answer came. I'm Special Investigator Dana Mercer with the Kentucky Attorney General's Office Medicaid Fraud and Financial Exploitation Unit. We have reviewed an emergency referral alleging elder financial exploitation, forged property transfer, diversion of medical equipment, and misuse of protected healthcare supply assets. Dr. Vale quietly reached for his briefcase. A deputy blocked him. The room began to murmur. Nathan pointed at me. This is absurd. He is unstable. He emptied an operating account and disappeared. We have medical documentation. Dana Mercer turned to Dr. Vale. Doctor, we will discuss your documentation separately. His face lost all color. Elias opened the shareholder agreement on the table. As of 9:39 this morning, by vote of the Independent Ethics Panel, Nathaniel Whitaker's executive authority has been suspended under Section 9, Breach of Stewardship Provision. All high-risk transfers are frozen. All collateralized assets are under review. All equipment movement requires independent authorization. Nathan stared at the document like it was written in another language. You cannot do that, he said. I finally spoke. You signed that you could be removed if you used this company for undisclosed personal benefit. I was 28 when I signed that. You were old enough to cash the bonus that came with it. Vanessa's composure cracked. Thomas, please. You are angry. We can fix this as a family. A family, I repeated. I looked at my son. The whole room faded for a moment, leaving only him and the boy he used to be. The boy in the little company cap. The boy Eleanor made pancakes for. The boy I had carried half asleep from the van into the house. Then I saw the man who forged my name onto my home. No, I said. Families do not bury fathers to hide invoices. Nathan lunged one step forward. A deputy caught his arm. This is my company, he shouted. Every employee in that room heard it. Not our company, not the employee's livelihood, not the patient's supply chain. My company. Dana Mercer nodded to the deputies. Nathaniel Whitaker, you are being detained pending questioning regarding financial exploitation and related fraud allegations. Vanessa cried out as one deputy turned Nathan gently but firmly. He looked at me, then truly looked, and for the first time in years, he seemed to understand that age had not made me weak. It had made me patient. As they led him toward the door, he said, Dad, tell them this is a mistake. I held Eleanor's locket in my pocket. The mistake, I said quietly, was believing love gave you permission to steal. The conference room doors closed behind him. No one moved. Then Luis removed his cap, pressed it against his chest, and said, Mr. Whitaker, what do we do now? I looked around at the frightened faces of the people my son had nearly sacrificed. Now, I said, we save what he tried to burn. The first hours after Nathan was taken away did not feel like victory. They felt like standing in the ashes of a house I had been pretending was still whole. The conference room emptied slowly. People moved with the quiet confusion that follows a storm when everyone is still checking whether the roof remains attached. Managers returned to their departments. Finance staff gathered copies of the emergency orders. Luis walked the warehouse floor himself, telling drivers the company would meet payroll, routes would continue, patients would not be abandoned. That mattered more than anything else. At 5 o'clock, I stood in the loading bay watching two trucks pull out into the gray evening. Their headlights cut across wet concrete. Oxygen concentrators, replacement bed rails, wheelchair parts, and wound care mattresses were strapped inside, headed to small facilities that would never make headlines, but would absolutely notice if we failed them. Ruth stood beside me with her coat buttoned to her chin. You should sit down, she said. I have been sitting too much these past 4 years. No, she said, you have been grieving. That is different. I looked at her, and for a moment I could not speak. Elias spent the evening with investigators in the finance office. Vanessa's bank accounts were temporarily frozen pending review of the forged deed and equipment diversions. Dr. Vale was escorted out separately, silent and sweating through his collar. Calvin Price's name had turned the state investigators' polite interest into something sharper. Dangerous lenders dislike daylight, and daylight had just entered the room with a badge. By 8 o'clock, the building was quiet. Only the night crew remained. I walked to the old wall near the employee entrance where Eleanor had insisted we hang photographs from the early days. There we were, me with black hair and a back brace, Eleanor holding a clipboard, Ruth looking annoyed at a Christmas party, Luis at 26 standing beside his first delivery truck, and Nathan, age 8, grinning in a company cap 2 sizes too large. I touched the picture. For all his cruelty, he had not arrived in this world cruel. I needed to remember that, not to excuse him, but to keep myself from becoming him. My prepaid phone rang at 8:19. Unknown number. I answered. For a few seconds I heard only the hollow background noise of a county detention center. Then my son spoke. "Dad." His voice was raw. I closed my eyes. "Nathan." "They won't let Vanessa talk to me. The attorney says the state might bring charges. He says if the federal people get involved, this could ruin everything. Everything." Even then, he spoke of ruin as if it had just begun when consequences arrived. "What do you want?" I asked. "I need you to tell them you overreacted." The pain of that sentence was clean and final. "You need me to lie. I need you to remember I'm your son." I leaned against the wall beneath the old photographs. My knees felt suddenly tired. I remembered that longer than was wise. He breathed into the phone. "You emptied my account." "No," I said. "I emptied an account you were never supposed to own. You humiliated me in front of everyone. You called me a burden in front of everyone." He went silent. For one small moment I thought perhaps the memory had finally reached him. The country club, the locket, his mother's name hanging unspoken over a table full of strangers. Then he said I was under pressure. And there it was. The same doorway with a different paint color. Pressure. Stress. Vanessa. The market. The lenders. Anything but the mirror. "Nathan," I said quietly, "a man's character is not revealed when life is easy. It is revealed when pressure puts its hand around his throat." His voice cracked with anger. "You think you're so righteous. No, I think I was blind." The line hummed between us. I looked at the photograph of him as a child and felt the strange double grief of losing someone who was still alive. "I gave you comfort and called it love," I said. "I gave you access and called it trust. I gave you chances and called it patience. But what I never gave you, son, was permission to steal from sick people, forge my name, frighten employees, and turn your father's age into a weapon." He said nothing. So I gave him the sentence I had been carrying since Ruth's kitchen. "I did not empty your bank account, son. I emptied the lie you built your life on." His breathing changed. Maybe the words hurt him. Maybe they only offended him. I may never know. "Dad," he whispered, "what happens to me now?" That was the first honest question he had asked. I wanted to say I did not care. Some injured part of me wanted to enjoy his fear, to hold the power he had tried to hold over me. But Eleanor had not loved a cruel man, and I would not become one in her name. "What happens next depends on how much truth you can stand," I said. "Tell the investigators everything. Give them Calvin Price. Give them the shell companies. Give them every person who helped you. Protect the employees you almost destroyed. That is the only road left that still has light on it. And if I do, I will not save you from justice." His breath caught. "But I will not stop praying you survive it." For the first time, Nathan did not answer with anger. He simply cried quietly, like someone ashamed to let the sound exist. I stayed on the line until the automated voice announced his time had ended. After the call disconnected, I remained beneath the photographs for a long while. Luis found me there, near midnight. "You okay, Mr. Whitaker?" I looked at the picture of Eleanor, then at the trucks outside, ready for morning routes. "No," I said, "but I am standing." That was all any wounded man can promise at first. In the weeks that followed, Louisville did what every city does after a private family disaster becomes public. It whispered. Some whispered that Nathan had always been too polished. Some whispered Vanessa had pushed him. Some whispered I should have handled it quietly, as if quietness had not been the soil where the rot grew. A few people called me ruthless. A few called me brave. Most did not know enough to call me anything at all. The investigators moved slowly but thoroughly. Calvin Price's lending operation cracked first. Once deputies searched the airport storage units, they found stolen equipment, falsified inventory tags, and resale documents connected to facilities that had paid for supplies they never received. Nathan's shell companies unraveled one by one. Vanessa's cousin lost her notary commission and then her nerve. Dr. Vale's careful medical language collapsed the moment his bank records showed the payment. Truth, when it finally stands up, is heavier than any lie. Nathan cooperated, eventually. Not nobly, not at first. Fear had to strip him down before honesty had room to enter. He admitted the equipment diversions, the forged deed, the fake competency petition, and the debt to Calvin Price. He claimed Vanessa knew everything. Vanessa claimed Nathan made every decision. Their lawyers did what lawyers do. I did not attend every hearing. There is a point where watching your own child answer for his choices stops being justice and starts becoming a second funeral. The house came back to me on paper before it came back to me in spirit. Elias fixed the deed. The court voided the transfer. One cold morning, I stood in the foyer beneath the staircase where Nathan once slid down the banister in his pajamas, and I realized ownership is a poor substitute for warmth. Eleanor's needlepoint still hung in the hallway. A home is where kindness stays. I took it down, wrapped it carefully, and carried it to my truck. Then I sold the house. People were shocked by that. They said I should keep it because I had won. But winning is not the same as healing. Some houses become too crowded with ghosts. Eleanor was not in those walls anymore. She was in the work we had started, the promises we had kept, and the people who still needed us to show up. Whitaker Medical Supply survived, barely at first. Ruth returned as interim chief financial officer and terrified 3 departments into honesty by lunch on her first day. Elias rebuilt our governance controls. Luis became chief operating officer, though he argued with me for 20 minutes before accepting. "I'm a warehouse man," he said. "You are the reason the warehouse still has a conscience," I told him. 6 months later, the board voted unanimously to make him president. No one deserved it more. I remained chairman, but this time the title meant oversight, not denial. We created an employee profit-sharing plan. We strengthened the Whitaker Continuity and Care Trust. We funded Eleanor's Care Fund with more than the original $100,000. The first grants went to 4 rural nursing homes in eastern Kentucky. Emergency beds, oxygen concentrators, lift chairs, and backup generators. I drove the first delivery myself. Louise said it was unnecessary. Ruth said it was stubborn. They were both correct. At a small care home outside Pikeville, an 89-year-old woman named Mrs. Hanley took my hand after our crew installed a replacement bed. My son used to say, "Old people cost too much," she told me. I felt something inside my chest bend. "What did you say to him?" I asked. She smiled with very few teeth and more dignity than half the men I had known. "I told him he was expensive once, too." That evening I sat in my motel room and cried for the first time since the country club. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just an old man on the edge of a bed, grieving the son he had loved, the wife he missed, and the years he had spent confusing rescue with parenting. Nathan wrote me one letter before sentencing. It was 4 pages long. Some of it sounded like his lawyer, some of it sounded like shame. One paragraph sounded like my son. "I remember the cap you gave me when I rode in the van with you. I remember Mom telling me to carry clipboards like it mattered. I don't know when I became someone who forgot that people were inside the work. I'm sorry I called you a burden. I was the burden. I just made you carry me too long." I read that paragraph 3 times. Then I folded the letter and placed it inside Eleanor's locket box. I have not forgiven him completely. I will not lie to make myself sound holy. Forgiveness is not a switch an old man flips because the story needs a clean ending. Some wounds have to be cleaned every day before they close. But I have stopped wishing for a different past. That is its own kind of mercy. These days, I live in a smaller house near the river. The old blue Chevy sits in the driveway. Eleanor's needlepoint hangs in the kitchen, where I can see it every morning. On Fridays, I visit the warehouse. On Sundays, I bring flowers to my wife and tell her what the company did that week. And sometimes, when the sun is low and the river turns gold, I think about the night my son called me a burden. He thought he was naming my weakness, but he was revealing his own. At 72 years old, I learned that blood can create a family, but gratitude is what keeps it alive. Love without boundaries becomes permission. Kindness without truth becomes a cage. And a father who refuses to be erased is not cruel. He is finally remembering the value of his own life. If this story reached something in you, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from. If you have ever been made to feel like a burden by someone you carried, I hope you remember this. Your worth does not expire because someone stopped being grateful. Share this with someone who needs that reminder, and subscribe if you believe stories like this still matter.